Well, Gareth Harding is an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Missouri-Columbia and director of the Missouri School of Journalism's Brussels program, which was launched in January 2008. I have to mention they have an absolutely unbelievable facility. A group of teachers from our Center for the Study of Europe were able to go there this summer, and we envy his great location and superb facilities. Harding is a Brussels-based freelance journalist with more than a decade of experience writing about the European Union and European politics. Before that, he worked as a speechwriter and political advisor in the British and European parliaments. He has written for Time Magazine, United Press International, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a number of other outlets. You may have seen some of his most recent articles in Foreign Policy Magazine, which I'd recommend you take a look at. Harding has been a tutor at the European Journalism Center for 9 years and is also a documentary filmmaker and media trainer. He was educated at the London School of Economics, where he studied history and politics and worked as a political advisor in the House of Commons, the European Commission, and European Parliament before becoming a journalist. A native of Wales, Harding considers Brussels his adopted home, and he speaks French and Spanish and basic Norwegian and German. Today's topic, building the EU without Europeans. Please join me in welcoming Gareth Harding.
Thanks very much, Corey. Thanks for having me today at the Kennedy Center. I'm really delighted to be here in Utah. I sound like a politician saying that, but I truly mean it. I've been here for 4 or 5 days now. Spent a couple of days up in Sundance. And then a couple of days down near Moab and the Arches and Canyonlands. So beautiful, beautiful state. So many temptations. I'm just surprised you get any work done around here. I'd like to talk to you today about what I consider to be the roots of Europe's political and economic crisis, which I believe in building the EU without Europeans. Yes, you may say, but what's a European? And that question, posed by one of my American students in Brussels, should have been easy enough for me to answer. After all, I've lived in mainland Europe, in Oslo, Prague, and Brussels for the last 2 decades. I speak several European languages, although I prefer not to take questions in Norwegian and Czech, if that's okay with you today. They test me out. I studied European history and politics in university. My best friends are scattered across the continent. My wife is French, and my children bilingual. So if anyone should be European, I am. And yet, I found myself stuttering as I searched for an answer. I waffled for a bit about European values, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, but realized that many non-European countries could also lay claim to those values, including this one. So I left my class confused, or more confused than my students. And the more I mulled over this question, the more I came to the conclusion that after over half a century of European integration and over 200,000 pages of EU laws, we still have little idea what Europe is, where its borders lie, what it stands for and against, and what binds its people together, and where it's heading in the future. In 1948, Winston Churchill said, every speech has to have a Winston Churchill quote, doesn't it? We hope to see a Europe where men of every country will think of being European as of belonging to their native land. Well, over half a century of unification later, there is less mobility than when Churchill made his speech. Roughly 2% of Europeans live in another EU state. And in opinion polls, voters identify themselves much more with their nation state than with Europe. As the former European Commissioner and head of the BBC, Chris Patton, has said, the nation is alive and well, and more potent than ever in some respects. It's the largest unit, perhaps, to which people will willingly accord emotional allegiance. I would tend to agree, and I don't say that as a nationalist. In fact, I'd even go further and say that the nation is too big for many people to associate with in Europe. As the map outside shows, the one on the right, the old map of Europe, superimposed with the border changes, Europe has 20 more states now than it did in 1988, due to the splintering of countries like the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and others. And there will be more on the way if Belgium, Spain, or Britain shatter. Real possibilities, which we can talk about later. This is not to deny one can have multiple identities. First and foremost, I consider myself Welsh, but my nationality is British, and I feel obviously a lot of affinity with my fellow islanders. My passport also says I'm a citizen of the European Union, although this feels more like an administrative attachment or administrative affiliation rather than an emotional attachment. I don't wake up in the morning saying, thank the Lord I'm European. For the foreseeable future, I believe we'll continue to identify ourselves more with our regions and states than with the European Union. But this is not to deny that Europeans are slowly coming together and that a nascent European public sphere is emerging. Most Europeans care more about the result of the Eurovision Song Contest, that annual festival of kitsch and glitz, a bit like a kind of pre-pop idol, but with nations pitted against each other. I strongly advise you to watch it if you can ever get the chance. It's quite a hoot. So I think they care more about that. In fact, there's a stat showing that more people watch the Eurovision Song Contest than vote in the European Parliament elections. I think they also care more about who wins the European Champions League final than the European elections. Erasmus has also given almost 3 million students the chance to spend time studying abroad. Erasmus is one of the most popular EU programs, which basically subsidizes study abroad, which you've got to admit, it's got to be a good thing. And thanks to airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet, which are basically kind of Southwest Airlines' poor cousins, Europeans are crisscrossing the continent like ever before. Of course, much of the credit for this as well is due to the EU and to EU laws. But Europe will ultimately be built by Europeans, not by Brussels edicts. Indeed, I would say that European integration owes as much to brash entrepreneurs like Ryanair's Michael O'Leary as it does to the EU founding fathers like Jean Monnet. It's also undeniable that Europeans do have certain things in common. We are wary of war, given the fact that we've fought against each other for centuries, if not millennia. We tend to be concerned about the environment. We're increasingly secular. We reluctantly accept high taxes as a price to pay for cradle-to-grave welfare services. And we enjoy our generous holidays, which you envy so much with your 2 weeks. And we'll gloat about our 4- and 6-week holidays with pride. And our nice lunch breaks and our love of food, especially if you visit the EU institutions and see the officials on their 2 or 3 hour boozy lunch breaks. Now, there may not be a European dream, as Jeremy Rifkin, the American author, argued, but there is a European way of life. If you're standing on the Charles Bridge in Prague or blazing on La Concha Beach in San Sebastian, you just know you're in Europe. And what a wonderful place that is. So Europe has certain common values as well. I'm on the good bit for now. The nasty stuff's coming in a minute. So Europe has common values: freedom, peace, rule of law, prosperity, diversity and solidarity. However, these are hardly unique to Europe. The United States, Canada, Australia could all claim those values, and they're not always applied in reality. For example, try telling Greeks about the prosperity they enjoy now. Try telling Poles about the solidarity offered to them by the French after they joined the EU. So there are common European traits, but there is no European people, as Geert Mak, in his magisterial book, which I strongly recommend, called In Europe, wrote about. He said there is not a single language, but dozens of them. There are still no truly European political parties, and pan-European newspapers and television stations still lead a marginal existence. And above all, there's very little in the way of a shared historical experience. He continues, people need stories in order to grasp the inexplicable, to cope with their fate. The individual nation with its common language and shared imagery can always forge these experiences into one cohesive story. But Europe cannot do that. Unlike the United States, it still has no common story. Now, there are huge differences between states in America. I spent 5 months last year living in Missouri, so I can see the differences between there and here and New York and Florida and elsewhere I've been. But at the end of the day, I think Americans feel American. They know what it is to be American and are proud of that fact. Their hearts beat faster when they sing the Star-Spangled Banner or watch their athletes win gold medals at the Olympics. Most know their Constitution. In some states, I believe, in Illinois, for example, you have to pass a test on the Constitution before you can carry on in school. And they roughly know how their political system works. They speak the same language and are obsessed by the same sports that few other people in the world understand. Talking of which, commiserations. Sorry to bring it up, but I saw the game in the bar the other night. Didn't understand much of it, but I got the result. I know it hurts. The EU, on the other hand, has created a common currency, laws, institutions, many of the trappings, many of the symbols of a nation state. A passport, an anthem. Anyone know the EU's anthem? If you don't, you're in common company with Europeans, because we don't either. It's Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy. Yeah? There's no words to it. I think an EU committee designing the words for our anthem would be quite fun. It'd probably take about 7 years. We even have a flag. I guess you've seen that one around. Anyone? 12 gold stars, blue background. It's a flag which is only voluntarily waved at Ryder Cup golf matches between the United States and Europe. What it lacks, I think, though, is a common people who share a common language, history, language, or narrative, or at the very least are able to identify with the political construct that has been created in their name. We have Europe. Now we need Europeans, was how the former Polish foreign minister Bronislaw Geremek put it. The problem is you cannot manufacture Europeans like toy soldiers. It takes time for people to evolve, and imposing artificial political constructs on disparate peoples has often ended in failure or disaster throughout history. Now, the EU was built on the belief that we are one people with one common destiny, an ever closer union, in the words of the founding document, the Treaty of Rome. We're now discovering, though, that regional and national differences are not dissolving, and that Europeans think and act very differently from another. The Italian concept of the law, or even stopping at red lights, is very different from that in Sweden. Latvians have a very different view of Russia, given their history, than Germans do. And what an Irishman is prepared to pay in taxes, roughly 20–25%, is vastly different from what a Dane or a Belgian is prepared to pay. I pay around 50%. Now, there's nothing wrong with differences between people and countries, of course. The EU is a way of managing on those differences peacefully. But this is the crux for me. Compromising on, say, food packaging legislation is not the same as compromising on border protection, defense policy, taxation. Those go to the heart of national sovereignty, what a state is all about. So I don't think the Brits will accept Belgian levels of taxation. The French, I don't think, will ever agree to scrap the EU's generous farm subsidies, which they benefit so much from. And no nation will send its sons and daughters to fight in a war it opposes even if a majority in Brussels supports the use of force. For example, as Germany demonstrated with Libya. And that's the crux as well. It wouldn't matter what the European Union was or what Europeans are if the EU remained a glorified free trade bloc, a bit like NAFTA, which it was until the early 1990s. But then came the big change with Maastricht and the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. Because when a group of states joined together to create a common currency with common rules, it goes without saying that they're going to have to be able to trust each other to stick to those rules. And when countries hand over control of their external frontiers to others, they have to feel confident that others can do the job. It matters to ordinary citizens too. If a German worker retires years earlier than a Greek worker, that German has every right to ask why he should be paying part of his hard-earned taxes to Greeks so that they can work less. Likewise, a poor Briton on a housing estate has every right to ask why he should be subsidizing rich French farmers or even rich British farmers. You know, Prince Charles gets EU subsidies for his farms, which I don't think makes much sense. The problem is we've transferred massive powers to the European Union without fully trusting either the EU or its member states to use those powers fairly or efficiently. And this reveals a striking breakdown of trust and legitimacy. Firstly, trust. The Dutch don't trust the Bulgarians and Romanians to guard their borders properly, so they're shut out of the Schengen deal on open borders. The Poles and the Balts don't trust the EU to defend them against aggression from the East, potentially. So they rely on NATO and the Americans for their collective defense. And the Brits, well, the Brits don't trust Europeans to do anything better than they can themselves, except perhaps dress more stylishly, cook tastier food, and produce better-made cars. Secondly, legitimacy. The EU has amassed extraordinary powers, but this has largely been done by stealth, without consulting the people, and without many of the safety valves which we take for granted in most democracies. No wonder that 53% of Europeans don't think their voice counts in the European Union. So, how can we bring Europeans closer together and closer to the institutions that are supposed to speak in their name? Firstly, I think that citizens have to have a greater say in who runs the EU. The European Commission and the Council presidents should, in my opinion, be elected. It gives people a say in the leaders they elect, just like you elect, obviously, your president. The directly elected European Parliament, not the unelected European Commission, should have the right to draft legislation. At the moment, it's just the Commission, unelected bureaucrats, essentially, who can propose legislation. I think that's wrong, and it's pretty unique in the world. And the voice of the people must be listened to in referenda, even if they come up with the wrong answers. Here I'm referring to Ireland, notoriously, who voted no, or the Irish people voted no to 2 EU treaties, and then were told by Brussels to go back and vote again to come up with the right answer. That is not how democracy works. No means no in politics, as well as other things. Secondly, we can't create an EU without Europeans. So every effort must be made to promote travel, exchange, and interaction between Europeans. Subsidizing, for example, Interrail tickets to allow young people to discover Europe, sponsoring European sporting tournaments, rock festivals, perhaps, boosting the budget for Erasmus and foreign language learning programs or traineeships in other countries. To me, these seem more sensible ways of building Europe and spending our money than doling out tens of billions of euros to the 5% of the EU population who are farmers. Finally, the EU has to do a better job of connecting with people. Instead of endlessly repeating EU or pro-EU mantras, supporters of the European project should create a culture of debate by listening to the people and entering into an honest dialogue with them. Perhaps they could take a few lessons from Pope Francis in this respect, who seems to be winning hearts and minds by just entering into a debate with people rather than laying down dogmas and saying that this is the truth and there's only one truth. They should also occasionally admit that they're wrong on the euro, or perhaps on the preconditions for joining the euro, the rules of the eurozone, or admitting Cyprus, a divided Cyprus, into the EU in 2004, and have the humility to apologize and say mistakes were made, again, a bit like current Pope. If the EU wants to connect with its citizens, it needs to explain its policies using simple, clear language. But above all, it has to show how it changes people's lives for the better. If the EU can convince hard-working taxpayers in Milan, Manchester, or Munich that it puts more money in their pockets, makes their jobs, streets, and pensions more secure, and provides better schools and hospitals for them and their families, then it will succeed. If it doesn't, I fear it will creak, crack, and ultimately collapse. Now, I've been critical of the EU and the concept of European identity, but I don't want for 1 second for you to go away thinking I'm some sort of little Englander, Eurosceptic, anti-European. I love my crazy, confused continent. I'm steeped in its history, politics, and culture. I'm also confident my 2 daughters will consider themselves much more European than I do, which is probably a good thing. My 10-year-old daughter, Lola Manon, once declared she was half Belgian, half French, and half Welsh. Now, if that's not a future European, I don't know what is. Thanks very much. I'd welcome any questions. I'm open to any. I've already had questions on my opinion on gun laws and same-sex marriage from high school students this morning. So I think I'm pretty much ready for anything. Please, the floor is yours.
We're trying a new system that will require you to steel yourself. I'm going to queue up here in front of the mic. And tell us your name, what you're studying, and as you're coming up in the rush to ask questions,
I can see the rush.
Gareth's benefit, the first one's always the toughest, right? How many of you have lived in Europe for at least, let's say, 3 months?
Wow.
How many of you speak a European language?
I don't know if American English does. I just lost my audience. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Thanks. My name's Greg Peacock. An older student, I suppose. We never stopped studying and understanding things. I was struck a little bit in your earlier remarks by what I thought was a overly pessimistic view of the European Union. Quite often, I'm assuming most of the students here are from the United States. We often compare the United States to the emerging European Union and say, why can't they be more like us? Of course, we do that regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the situation. That's a bit our problem. But if you look back, for example, at the history of the United States, you will also see that some of the same issues that you highlighted were those that we struggled with very long in our history. It took some massive events such as the Civil War, to some extent both of the world wars, to transform us into the society we are today in the 21st century. And I think that if you look at the length of time that Europe has been struggling with the large problems that you highlight, frankly, it's a very young institution. And what I found, the second half of your remarks struck me as much more optimistic and much more along the lines that I think about the EU, and that is that it is an institution which is becoming more legitimate because it is in fact extending the franchise much more to its citizens than it has in the past. The European Parliament is becoming much more relevant than it has ever been. It's far from being where it should be. There is greater transparency being demanded all the time of the central institutions in Brussels, and I think that given what's happened in Strasbourg with the Parliament and other places, that we're likely to see that change. I think by the time your 10-year-old is these young people's age, or certainly by the time they're my age, I think that she will see almost certainly a much more transparent, much more democratic, in that sense, much more legitimate EU. I would also say that having lived in a number of European countries for a number of years, that my perception is that a German of the age of these college students would see the world much more similarly to a French person of the same age than would most of these students if they looked at the world and had a sense of how they saw the world and what the likely future was for themselves and for their children. So I just wonder if you'd comment on that, if in fact the trends don't strike you as more positive than negative. Simply grappling with the EU, with the question of the euro, I think, has forced many very reluctant members of the EU to move towards considering giving up a measure of sovereignty they would have never considered giving up only 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. And I see those as all very positive signs for the EU in the future.
Yeah.
They haven't done a good job at selling the incredible benefits. I mean, why did Greece agree to join, even though they cheated to get in and have cheated all the way through? They recognize the benefits, as have the Germans, I think.
Yeah.
It's just, maybe they're not selling it well enough.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions in there.
No, it's a good point, and I do take them to heart because I gave a speech in Missouri 4 years ago, which I turned into an article for Wall Street Journal. I always try and turn these things into money. Which was called Europe Reborn. And it was on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my thesis then was much more optimistic than my thesis today. Because if you take a historical perspective and you look back over the last quarter of a century, or you wind yourself back to 25 years ago, Europe has changed and changed utterly, to quote Yeats. It's probably the continent which has changed politically and in terms of borders and political structures more than maybe any on the planet. I mean, it went from a completely divided continent with a real fear of war and annihilation from the Cold War, frankly, to a continent now which is much more at peace with itself and breathing with two lungs, not divided anymore. So believe me, having lived through that existential terror almost of the 70s and 80s of a nuclear war, having briefly lived in communist Czechoslovakia and post-communist Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic, I feel those things very strongly. And I honestly think, it's not coming through, but the European Union is a good thing on balance. Yeah. But I think we need to be highly critical of it, and so that we can make it a better thing. Just throw on a couple of the points you brought up there. I see the analogy of the United States. Obviously, it's a clear one. You know, you started with 13 colonies, states came together, created the United States. We started with 6 back in 1957. We're 28 today. More and more powers emerging in Brussels, just as like over a century, more powers were transferred, let's say, to Washington from the States. And that took a while. You know, I was just up in Sundance with a good political professor friend of mine, and he was giving me a little tutorial on these things. And I don't think you had federal taxation, for example, until the First World War. Yeah. You didn't have a central bank until, I think, a century after the foundation of the United States. You didn't have a currency in the first few decades. So
I would argue we don't share a language yet.
Well, this is, yeah, but this is you brought up the next point I was going to make. And so you can see some of the similarities. You could say in some respects that the EU is going faster to integration than the United States did in its history. But there are differences, and I'll bring up some of those. And they're quite crucial for me. One, you have a common language. You can communicate with each other. You know, sometimes it's quite difficult to understand those Texans, but, you know, at least you can communicate with each other. We literally can't. You know, a Greek fisherman speaking to a Swedish metal worker would have problems. Okay, English is increasingly becoming Europe's lingua franca. I love saying that phrase to my wife. It just drives her mad as a French woman. But it's true that, you know, Europe is becoming more English-speaking. So that's one difference. Secondly, at this time, they were young colonies. They just shrugged off, just kicked out the Brits. But still they had little history as individual states or colonies. Whereas we've been around, as you know, for centuries, some European states. We also, or you guys, hadn't gone to war with each other for centuries. Okay, you had that civil war in the mid-19th century, a bit later. But I mean, we have been fighting each other for centuries, if not millennia. So there's that kind of historical animosities, which are really deep in Europe. Every time we play the English in rugby, there's a little bit of 1286 in us when we put in those tackles. That's when we were invaded by the English. Then I would say, when you're talking about, well, Germans have much more in common with French and so on, I'm not so sure. I mean, a Greek and a Swede in terms of personalities, political systems differences. A Brit and an American usually has quite a lot in common, including a shared language, or divided by a shared language, as Churchill said. Oh, here it comes up again. Finally, I would just say on giving up some of the sovereignty because of the euro, yes, that's happening, but I think the people will resist that. Because it's okay, as I said in the speech, to give up sovereignty over packaging legislation. But when you're told by Brussels you have to cut your health budget or your education budget because you're racking up too much debt, when you've had an elected government, you've elected a parliament and a government to make those decisions for you, and you're told by basically unelected bureaucrats, commissioners, to change that because it doesn't meet with EU edicts, I just don't think people will accept that, and we've heard that. So on the one hand, François Hollande, French president, says, we want a European government, an EU government like the United States, okay? Next thing, he's told by Brussels to keep his debt under 3%. He says, we're not accepting any orders from Brussels. And that's just an inherent contradiction. And I think there will be a revolt against that, as we're seeing now in Greece and some other Club Med countries, where there's a popular revolt, frankly, against the European Union and what they see as the edicts being handed down by them, and an austerity measures which are strangling Greeks. Yeah. So I do take your point, really. I really, honestly, as I said at the end, I hope to God you don't think I'm a Eurosceptic. I just want to be, I think it's important for, especially journalists, to take a critical eye towards the European Union, as well as praised it for what it's done right.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's important to be critical. It just seems to me that the trends are somewhat in that direction.
Yeah, historically they are.
Forcing the banking system
Historically they are.
across Europe, for example, to come to some common, some common agreements is in fact a response to the euro crisis, which may, in the end, 50 years from now, make a significant difference. I've got to leave time to the others.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I was just wondering, as we talk, some of what I've run into looking at Europe and asking the questions about the EU is what is the vision? And do you think there is a shared vision of what the EU is going to be in the end? Or is it just people trying to figure it out, looking at the United States, looking at other trade unions, and trying to figure out what they want to forge?
That's a good question. I don't think there is a shared vision. Clearly there's not. I mean, Brits don't have the same vision of where Europe should head or is going as, say, French or Germans. Eurosceptic parties in the European Parliament, or nationalist parties, have a wildly different version of where they'd like to see Europe than some of the federalist Christian Democrat or Social Democrat ones. So no shared vision, but there never really has been. It's, joining the EU is like kind of jumping on a moving train where you don't know the destination. It makes for an exciting ride, but a little bit nervous when you don't know where you're going. So a little different from the United States, which had a very clear-cut constitution almost from the start, which has stood the test of time. It's largely the same constitution today, 230-odd years later, whereas we still have no constitution. We have a series of treaties, but our attempt at forging a constitution in 2004 was rejected by guess who? The French and the Dutch, two of the founding members of the EU. So, no, I don't think we do have a common vision, and I think that's a problem.
Thank you.
My name is Eliza Campbell. I'm studying political science, and I really enjoyed your one-word shout-out to Europe's new little brother, Bulgaria, having just spent a year and a half there. And I wanted to ask about an issue that is a really big issue there from what I saw, and also becoming a bigger trans-Europe issue, which is human trafficking. And since that essentially has to be like I said, a very much transcontinental, trans-Europe issue. I wonder what you think the role of the EU is in dealing with that and sort of creating legislation around that, especially since so many people have argued that certain things about the EU's increased labor mobility actually increase the propensity of human trafficking.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on human trafficking, I'll confess. It's a big, big problem, though. And we've seen it increase, obviously, since Bulgaria and Romania joined in 2007. Bulgaria and Romania are the two poorest countries in the EU. Some would say the most corrupt. A lot of people in Brussels think it was a mistake to let them in or to give them a date of entry, because afterwards they basically backslided in a lot of reforms they needed to make. So some of the problems come from Bulgaria and Romania and the systems they have in place. You could blame it on the free movement of people. You know, for every free movement of a doctor or a lawyer, there's a free movement of someone who's being trafficked. I think the EU is acting against it to give it its praise, and we're setting up now kind of border agencies on the Frontex is a new European agency to guard the EU's borders. So that's stopping or trying to stop some of the trafficking coming in essentially from Moldova, which is not an EU state. It's the poorest country in Europe, not just the EU. Very poor country where a lot of Moldovans and Ukrainians are being trafficked. So it's a serious problem. And I think the EU is doing as much as it can, but you've got to understand that the EU is always hamstrung by the fact that it has limited resources and in some areas limited powers. Now, I would say in some areas I'd be happy for the EU to have more powers. It comes to clamping down on human trafficking or on fighting pollution or on removing remaining barriers to free trade. I'd be all in favor of the EU having more powers. Energy interconnections between states, even rail or transport connections where literally sometimes, you know, railways with different gauges can't cross borders. That sort of stuff obviously makes sense that we work together. But on other issues, I'm more skeptical about. I hope it's not too glib because I'm not an expert on it. It's the best I can do.
Thank you.
My name is John Collier, and I'm studying European Studies. And I just was wondering, obviously it's pretty clear that every nation, every state kind of has its own level of sovereignty it's willing to accept from the EU. I mean, England's not even willing to accept the currency, and other ones have different levels where they're willing to accept. What do you think is the ideal, just in your opinion, what's the ideal level of sovereignty that the EU should have?
I think probably the level of sovereignty it had in the 1980s. I think Maastricht was a step too far. Maastricht was basically the founding treaty of the European Union. It changed its name at that time in 1993 from the European Community to the European Union. It introduced the concept of the single currency, which was largely a political trade-off between France and Germany. When the French accepted German reunification, it was in exchange for them giving up the Deutschmark, essentially, so there wouldn't be a new German hegemon in the center of Europe. Imagine that. That hasn't happened, has it? That was a step too far, in my opinion. It went too far, too fast, and it didn't bring the people with them. You may remember the French voted on Maastricht in 1993, just when I arrived in Brussels. They voted 51% in favor and 49% against. If another 1% had voted against, we wouldn't have a single currency today. Germans were never asked. If they were asked to give up their Deutschmark, the beloved strong Deutschmark, which every other European currency pegged itself to, I think they'd have probably said 9 back then. So I think that was roughly the level. Look, I'm not opposed to giving up some of the sovereignty, or pooling, as they say in Brussels, to the EU. I think we've gone a lot further than, and I would accept going further than the United States or American citizens ever would. I mean, can you imagine from the start of the European project accepting a level of sovereignty or a level of power above the level of the nation state? Supranationalism, if you want to, have a pol science nerd definition of it. So supranationalism, a level of sovereignty above the level of the nation state. What's above Washington, D.C.? What's above the level of the President or the United States? Nothing. You're not going to, if you don't agree with the UN edict, you're not going to accept it, and no one's going to push you around to accept that. We have voluntarily signed up to a system which hands over a lot more sovereignty than that. So that, imagine, say, that America, let's put this in simplistic terms, America could be outvoted on environmental legislation, or it had a currency of the Americas it shared with Mexico, or it tore down the borders over the Rio Grande and let any Mexican who wants to come in, and any El Salvadorian or Guatemalan come in as well and work, retire, draw a pension, unemployment benefit here, that sort of stuff. Then, only then can you understand what we've done in Europe and the level of, the amount of sovereignty we've handed over or pooled in Brussels. Does that answer it?
Hi, I'm Warren Fraser. I'm an international relations student. You brought up earlier in your lecture the idea of the Scottish Home Rule,
Yeah.
so the secessionism,
Yeah.
but that seems like you never really kind of came back to that in
No.
terms of, so do you think that the creation of like a European identity, like a pan-European identity, would solve some of those issues?
It's a good question. It's really interesting, this one, because at the same time as though we're handing more powers to Brussels, we are in a way handing more powers to the regions, or regions are demanding those powers for themselves. So what we're seeing is the hollowing out of the nation state to a certain extent. And I think that some people, say the English, feel a bit disenfranchised by that. And I say the English, not the Welsh or the Scottish or others. So, for example, the Scots who are going to vote on in a referendum next year on independence, I think by the way that they'll vote no, they'll remain part of the Union, i.e. the United Kingdom. Most polls show that and have always showed that. They'll still obviously remain part of the United Kingdom, but they'll want more independence. For example, they've already been given a parliament about 10 years ago, just as the Welsh have. And that seems to be a demand which is happening all over Europe. It's not just particular to Britain. Belgium is basically a non-state. As probably René Magritte would have put, ceci n'est pas un état. This is not a state. It's basically some borders with an army and a football team and good chocolate and waffles. But in terms of actual powers, the powers of the federal government in Brussels, almost none. They've been devolved to the regions: health, education, transport. I mean, Flanders even has a foreign ministry in Washington, and it's not a country. Same thing happened in Spain. You saw a couple of weeks ago in Catalonia, hundreds of thousands of people holding hands for independence. And there's a strong prospect, I think, that Catalonia could break away. Paradoxically, I think it's almost that the European Union has enabled these regional powers to feel comfortable with breaking away, because the nation state has been hollowed out, that it wouldn't make that much difference if they did break away.
Right.
Yeah?
Thank you.
My name is Dal McKinnon, studying international relations as well. I recently read a piece by Robert Kagan arguing that Europe has entered a kind of state of perpetual peace with the European Union. Like you said, they're wary of war, and that is largely a result of, in his view, the United States taking on what it sees as threats to the Western world, policing the world and things like that. I'm just wondering what you think about that theory, that the fact that the U.S. doing that makes the European Union possible because it doesn't have to spend so much on defense budgets and military
Yeah.
spending and things like that. And if so, if you agree with that, then what would happen if the United States, stopped
Pulled the
policing
plug.
the world, and what would the European have to do in that case?
Excellent question. Robert Kagan, he's the one who invented this phrase. Let's see if I got it the right way around, but Europeans are from Venus and Americans are from Mars. Did I get it right? Basically that we view power, military power, completely differently. And if you look at Poland, for example, from Pew Research or German Marshall Fund, the United States, you'll see vastly different attitudes towards using force to impose your views in Europe than America. Although I think they're coming together a little bit, as we've seen recently from the Syria example, where in fact it was France who's all in favor of military action, and of course Britain, who's usually gung-ho about these things, voted it down in Parliament, and well, Obama's been flip-flopping each side on the issue and eventually handed it over to Putin to sort it out, as far as I could see. In terms of our military spending, yes, we are deeply wary of war, having experienced it for centuries, if not millennia. I would say we're on the verge of becoming pacifist as a continent, which I find troubling, because it's fine to be against war and stop killing each other. That's a good thing for Europe. But doesn't mean to say that everyone else is going to do that, as we saw with Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s on the horrors of the Balkan Wars, which left my generation completely traumatized and left Europe on the sidelines when 200,000 Bosnians were killed an hour flight away from Brussels. And Europe stood completely impotent on the side and basically let the slaughter happen. That's not the kind of Europe I want to see. Those are not European values to allow slaughter to happen, which is why I'm often in favor of humanitarian intervention in places like Libya or Mali. In fact, we have a right to protect. It's written in the UN Charter, which I think should be used more energetically. So I think if you've got strong values, you have to stand up for them, sometimes with strength. And Europeans, it seems, are not willing to do that. You know, famously, Austria spends more on opera than it does on its military force. And, you know, I think that that's living in a kind of never-never land. It's all very well in theory, but the reality is different. Like, what if Russia attacked Estonia? What would the European Union's response be? Firstly, it's got no duty to protect Estonia, because there's nothing in our treaty or constitution with a kind of, you know, like Article 5 in the NATO treaty, you know, all for one and one for all. So it would be down to NATO and America to protect Estonia. Just as the Americans, if you remember this ridiculous incident about 10 years ago when Morocco put its flag on this kind of rocky island between Gibraltar and Morocco. And the European Union's response was basically, we don't have a position on that. So Morocco had invaded part of European Union territory. And the European Union, literally, I was there in the press conferences, they said, well, you know, it's not, we don't have a response, sort of thing. And eventually it was Colin Powell who had to sort the whole thing out, you know, basically telling the Moroccans to get the hell out that island. So I just think we're adolescent. We take an adolescent response to security. Basically, we're grumbling about the Americans and American influence, but we're quite happy to accept the American security umbrella while we spend our money on our generous welfare state. And understandably, as Robert Gates said in his final speech, he made a very, very strong argument for Europeans to step up. I mean, he was basically saying, well, you know, your generous holidays are basically subsidized by the fact that we're protecting your back. So I think we need to grow up. That cleared them out.
That's because I have red hair.
Yeah.
My name's Kevin Huffner. I'm also an international relations major. Just wondering about, we talked about the sort of the two movements of more power to a unified state, but also a trend towards fragmentation. Do those things make European states more vulnerable to war and conflict or towards being invaded? Or
I think it makes it potentially more vulnerable internally, in that if nationalism raises its ugly head again, and we go back to the situation, a kind of Balkanization of Europe, where, you know, we're each with our jealously guarded borders. I don't want to return to that. But I think that the EU often confuses patriotism with nationalism. and they're suspicious of people who are proud of their own identities and countries. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You can be a patriot, proud of your country, without thinking you're the best, or better than others, which for me is a nationalist. So I'm slightly worried about that aspect of it. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for listening today. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.